He built a droid for his mother. He was 9 years old, a slave child in the desert, pulling scraps from the junk piles, assembling something out of nothing because he thought it might make her life a little easier. Nobody asked him to. Nobody knew he was doing it. He just did it. Because that is who he was. And that is the Anakin Skywalker that nobody ever talks about. Not the fall, not the armor, not the breathing. You already know that story. Everyone does. But there is another one, older and quieter and far more important. And it has been buried under the mythology for so long that most people have completely forgotten it was ever there. What if the person inside Darth Vader was never who you thought he was? What if the most important things about Anakin Skywalker are the things that were never in the tragedy? What if the reason the ending hits as hard as it does is because of something in him that nobody around him ever fully saw? Something that survived 23 years of darkness and a suit of black armor and an empire built on fear. Something that his son could feel across a galaxy, and that turned out, in the end, to be the most powerful thing in the story? This is not a story about the fall. The fall is real, and we will get there. But the fall is the last chapter of a much longer book, and most people have only ever read the ending. They have skipped the hundreds of pages that came before it. The pages where Anakin Skywalker was not a tragedy in progress, but a person. A specific, complicated, quietly extraordinary person. A boy who built things in the dark. A young man who mourned the deaths of soldiers nobody else was willing to grieve. A commander who learned names when the Republic only issued numbers. A mentor who broke every rule he had been taught in order to keep someone he cared about alive. A son who never stopped missing his mother. A husband who was terrified in ways that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with having already lost too much. This is the Anakin that nobody talks about. Not the cautionary tale, not the fallen hero, the actual person. The one who was there before the armor and in many ways never entirely left, even after it. To understand who he actually was, you have to go back. Not to the Jedi Order, not to prophecy, not to midichlorians or destiny or the chosen one mythology that defined how every other person in his life saw him. You have to go back further than all of that. You have to start with the desert. You have to start with a child who owned nothing, not even his own future, and who somehow managed to be generous anyway. Tatooine is not a place that produces gentle people. The twin suns beat down on a world that the Republic had essentially abandoned. A rock on the outer rim where the Hutts ran everything and the law was whatever the strongest creature in the room decided it was. The settlements scattered across that desert were not communities in any comfortable sense. They were survival arrangements. People clustered together because alone meant dead. And even together, life was a negotiation between what you needed and what the heat and the sand and the criminal economy of Hutt space were willing to allow. Children grew up fast there because the alternative was not surviving long enough to grow up at all. They learned early that the universe did not owe them anything, that kindness was a resource to be rationed carefully, and that hope was a dangerous luxury that could get you killed if you held onto it too openly. Anakin Skywalker grew up in that world, born into slavery in Mos Espa, owned by a Toydarian junk dealer named Watto, alongside his mother, Shmi. He had no memory of a time before the slave chip embedded beneath his skin, no memory of freedom, no experience of a life in which his labor and his time and his choices belonged to him. He was a child who woke up every morning in a condition that the Republic technically did not recognize and in practice did nothing to change. On a planet too far from the core worlds for anyone with power to concern themselves with. He should have been defined entirely by that circumstance. Most people would be. The weight of slavery has a way of pressing down on a person until there is nothing left but the shape of the thing that pressed them. It takes extraordinary inner resources to maintain any sense of self, any generosity of spirit, any warmth toward strangers, when your entire existence has been organized around the fact that your body and your time belong to someone else. And yet, the boy that Qui-Gon Jinn encountered in Watto's shop was not a child crushed into bitterness. He was not withdrawn or hostile or suspicious in the way that survival in that environment might reasonably have made him. He was warm. He noticed things. He paid attention to people in a way that most adults never learn. When the strange visitors came in from the storm, Anakin did not see them as a transaction or a threat or an irrelevance. He saw people who needed help, and he offered it, simply and without calculation. He invited them into his home. He shared what little his family had. His mother, Shmi, had something to do with that. The love between them was not a quiet or restrained thing. It was the organizing principle of both their lives, the one certainty in a world that offered very few certainties. Shmi Skywalker had raised a son under conditions that should have broken both of them, and she had somehow managed to raise someone capable of caring about people he had just met. But it was not only his mother's influence. There was something in Anakin himself that existed outside the conditions that should have shaped him. Some quality of attention and feeling and perception that was genuinely his own. He noticed details. He tracked how things worked. He built. This is something that gets mentioned briefly in accounts of his life, and then largely forgotten because it does not fit neatly into the tragedy framework, but it matters enormously to understanding who he actually was. Anakin Skywalker built a protocol droid from spare parts. He was 9 years old. He pulled components from the scrap that passed through Watto's shop, identified what each piece did, figured out how they fit together, and assembled a functioning artificial being out of garbage in a desert in a slave quarter. He did this because he thought it might make his mother's life easier. He was not showing off. He was not trying to demonstrate that he was special. He was solving a problem for someone he loved with the tools available to him, which happened to be his own extraordinary mind and whatever he could scavenge. The pod racer he built in secret tells a similar story. Pod racing on Tatooine was a sport that regularly killed its participants. The machines were brutally fast and almost impossible to control, designed for beings with faster reflexes than humans were supposed to possess. The tracks were unforgiving. The other racers were experienced and often vicious. Humans were not supposed to be able to compete at all. Not because pod racing required exotic biology, but because the reaction times involved exceeded what an unaugmented human nervous system could reasonably provide. Anakin's force sensitivity gave him perceptual advantages that he could not name or explain. A capacity to sense what was coming before his eyes could see it, to feel the track and the machine and the other racers as a continuous field of information rather than a series of discrete events. But he did not know that was what he was doing. He just knew he could fly. He knew it the way you know things that you have always been able to do, as an unremarkable fact about yourself that has always simply been true. And rather than that certainty making him arrogant, it made him joyful. When Anakin Skywalker flew, when he was in that pod and the engines were screaming and the canyon walls were blurring past him, He was not performing. He was not trying to prove anything. He was just completely uncomplicated alive in a way that his daily existence as a slave did not often allow. Speed was one of the few things in his life that was entirely his. Nobody could take the feeling from him. Nobody could own it or sell it or constrain it. In the air, he was free in the only way available to him, and he loved it with a straightforward and uncomplicated love that would stay with him his entire life. He also worried. This is important, and it tends to get lost in the larger narrative about Anakin's eventual psychological breakdown. But the fear that would later consume him was not a sudden development, not a product of the dark side or Palpatine's influence or the weight of war. It was there in the boy on Tatooine, running quietly under everything else. He dreamed about his mother. He dreamed about the places he had been told existed beyond the sand. And in the dreams there were always moments where those places dissolved and he was still in Mos Espa, still owned, still powerless. He worried about what would happen to Shmi if something happened to him. He worried in the way that people who have learned early that good things get taken away tend to worry, with a constant low-level alertness to the possibility of loss, a background awareness that nothing you love is ever entirely safe. That worry was not a character flaw. It was a reasonable psychological response to living a life in which the things he cared about were genuinely and continuously at risk. The galaxy would later pathologize his attachment as a weakness. What it actually was grief in waiting. He had already lost enough to know that losing was always possible. He had just not yet found the vocabulary to live with that knowledge without being undone by it. What happened the day Qui-Gon Jinn walked into Watto's shop is usually told as the beginning of Anakin's story. In the larger mythological sense, perhaps it was. But in the human sense, in the sense of who this child actually was, it was more of an interruption. Anakin Skywalker was already somebody before that moment. He was already a builder, a pilot, a protector, a friend to people who had nothing, a son who loved his mother with the whole of his small heart. The Jedi did not create him. The prophecy did not create him. The Force had arranged something extraordinary in that desert before anyone with the authority to recognize it showed up and put a name to it. And the tragedy is not that the extraordinary thing was eventually corrupted by the dark side. The tragedy is that nobody ever really saw it clearly in the first place. Not before, not during, and in many ways, not after. They saw the power and the prophecy and the potential and the problem. They almost never saw the person. Qui-Gon Jinn was not a conventional Jedi Master, and he knew it. He operated at the edges of what the Council was comfortable with, followed the living force rather than the mechanical calculations of the unified will, trusted his instincts over institutional consensus, and had built a reputation across decades of service as someone who would do what he believed was right, even when the Council explicitly told him to do otherwise. He was not reckless. He was principled in a way that happened to put him frequently at odds with authority, which is a different thing. He had a gift for seeing the Force in people who had not yet learned to see it in themselves. He was the right person to find Anakin Skywalker in that desert. He understood what he was looking at in a way that the Council, with all its collective wisdom and thousands of years of institutional knowledge, was never quite able to. And then he died. He died 3 days after meeting the boy. He died in a generator complex on Naboo, run through by a Sith apprentice's lightsaber, while his own apprentice watched from behind an energy barrier, unable to reach him in time. He lay on the floor with Obi-Wan Kenobi kneeling over him, and his last words were about Anakin. "Train the boy. He is the chosen one. He will bring balance." And then the light went out of his eyes, and Obi-Wan was left alone with a promise he had not made, and a child he had not asked for, and a weight that neither of them knew how to carry. Consider what those 3 days actually meant for Anakin. He had spent 9 years in slavery. He had grown up in a world where hope was rationed, and the future was not something you were permitted to think about in practical terms. And then a man walked in from the desert and looked at him differently from how anyone had ever looked at him before. Not with the pity that outsiders sometimes brought to Tatooine, the uncomfortable awareness of what slavery was, and the guilty relief of not being part of it. Not with the transactional calculation of Watto, for whom Anakin was an asset with a useful skill set. Qui-Gon looked at Anakin and saw something. Saw him specifically, this child, in these circumstances, and recognized something that changed the calculation of what Anakin's future could look like. He did not just free him, he named him as significant. He said, "In effect, the universe has been waiting for you." He said, "Your existence matters on a scale that goes beyond what is visible from this desert." He said, "You are not an accident or an inconvenience or a piece of property. You are the point of something." And Anakin, who had been told by the architecture of his entire life that he was none of those things, believed him. Of course he believed him. He was 9 years old, and the man was carrying a lightsaber and speaking with the certainty of someone who did not doubt what he saw. And then he was dead. 3 days. 3 days between the moment Anakin's world was permanently rearranged by someone telling him he mattered and the moment that person ceased to exist. What is left after that is not simply grief, though grief is certainly present. What is left is a promise with no one to deliver it, a significance that has been declared but not yet substantiated, a destiny that has been announced in the most authoritative possible terms by someone who is no longer alive to help navigate it. Anakin arrived on Coruscant as the chosen one before he had any idea what that meant or any support structure to help him figure it out. With his mother left behind on Tatooine, still enslaved, in the care of an apprentice who was himself still raw with mourning, Obi-Wan Kenobi kept the promise. He took Anakin as his Padawan, trained him, watched over him, gave his life structure and discipline and purpose. And in every measurable external sense, he did a remarkable job. Anakin became one of the most capable Jedi of his generation by virtually any standard. His combat ability was extraordinary. His Force connection was unprecedented. His tactical mind in the field was as good as anyone's. Obi-Wan gave him all of that. He gave him the tools. What he could not give him, not because he was a bad person, but because of the specific limitations that defined him, was the thing Anakin needed more than any of it. He could not meet him emotionally. He could not be the person in Anakin's life who could hear what Anakin was actually saying and stay present with it, without deflecting or reframing or gently steering the conversation back toward equanimity and the Jedi Code. He was brilliant at almost everything. He was not built for that. The relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin is one of the most genuinely complex in Star Wars, and one of the most frequently misread. It is not a story of a cold master and a passionate student. The warmth was real. Obi-Wan loved Anakin. Anyone who pays attention to the small moments across their years together can see it clearly. The way he talked about him to others, the way he worried when Anakin was reckless. The pride he could not always hide when Anakin did something extraordinary. The difficulty he had, even years after everything, in speaking about him without a particular quality of grief entering his voice. That love was genuine. It was also insufficient, not because love itself was insufficient, but because Obi-Wan's way of expressing it was filtered through a training that had specifically and deliberately taught him to manage emotional expression, to maintain equanimity, to be the stable presence in the room rather than the feeling one. The Jedi path, as Obi-Wan had internalized it, was not designed to produce people who could sit with another person's grief and simply be with it. It was designed to produce people who could redirect grief toward the Force, toward acceptance, toward the meditative calm that is genuinely useful in some circumstances and catastrophically useless in others. Anakin was not someone whose emotions could be redirected. He was someone who needed them met. These are different needs, and they require different responses. And the entire Jedi training system that shaped Obi-Wan was built on the assumption that the second need was actually a problem to be solved, rather than a legitimate human requirement to be honored. When Anakin came to Obi-Wan with fear, Obi-Wan offered philosophy. When Anakin came with grief, Obi-Wan offered perspective. When Anakin came with love, Obi-Wan offered the code. All of it was sincere. None of it was what was actually needed. And the accumulation of that mismatch over more than a decade built something in Anakin that neither of them could see clearly from inside it. A growing sense that his inner life was fundamentally incompatible with the people around him. That the things he felt most deeply were the things that least fit in the world he had been placed in. That he was somehow constitutionally wrong for the only home he had been given. There was also something specifically difficult about the power dynamic that the Jedi system created between them. A difficulty that neither of them was fully equipped to name. Obi-Wan was Anakin's master. That relationship has a built-in asymmetry that does not dissolve over time just because the Padawan becomes a knight. The patterns of deference and authority established in those early years shape how two people relate to each other long after the formal hierarchy has changed. Anakin spent his formative years learning to bring his questions and his doubts and his fears to someone whose role required him to have answers, to be settled, to model the equanimity that the apprentice was supposed to be working toward. This meant that the relationship, for all its genuine warmth, was structurally organized around Obi-Wan being okay and Anakin learning to be okay. There was no formal mechanism for the reverse. There was no built-in space for Anakin to be the one who was fine, while Obi-Wan worked something out. It was always the same direction. And for a person as emotionally intense as Anakin, having the relationship with your most important person permanently organized in that direction creates a specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of always being the one who needs something, who can receive care but never quite give it. Because the structure of the relationship does not have room for that exchange to flow both ways. None of this is Obi-Wan's fault. The system that produced him, the training that shaped his emotional architecture, the institutional culture of the Jedi Order in the last centuries of the Republic, these things made him who he was, and they were not designed with Anakin in mind. They were not designed for any student as emotionally complex and as psychologically unmoored as Anakin. The Jedi were designed to take children before the world had time to press too deep an impression on them. Infants and toddlers who could be shaped by the Order's values from their earliest moments of self-awareness. Anakin came to them at 9, already carrying Tatooine, already carrying slavery, already carrying his mother, and the dreams and the fear, already carrying 9 years of a life that had organized itself around entirely different principles than the ones the Jedi were trying to instill. He was not clay. He was already fired, and the Jedi, for all their power and their wisdom and their thousands of years of tradition, did not really have a method for working with someone who was not clay. What they had instead was the code. And Anakin spent his entire Jedi life trying to fit himself into something that had not been built to contain him, shaving off the parts that didn't fit, covering over the parts that couldn't be removed, performing equanimity for an institution that genuinely could not have accommodated what he actually was. And what he was, underneath all of it, was the most powerful Force user in living memory, trained by someone who loved him but could not fully reach him, in an order that had serious reservations about him from the day he walked through the door, on a mission that was simultaneously everything and impossible, trying to be what the galaxy needed while having never quite figured out what he needed, trying to be the chosen one, while still being a person who had not yet been given the tools to understand what that meant for the actual human being it was supposed to describe. The Clone Wars changed Anakin Skywalker in ways that are almost never given the attention they deserve. The fall is so large and so dramatic and so well documented that it tends to consume the entire reading of that period, as if the Clone Wars were simply the setting in which Anakin's destruction was arranged, and nothing else. But that misses something essential. The wars were also where Anakin became most fully himself, where the person he had been accumulating since Tatooine was given circumstances that fit him in ways the Temple and the Council and the political life of the Republic never had. He was extraordinary in combat. He was extraordinarily good at caring for the people in his command, and those two things together produced a kind of military leadership that was genuinely unusual and genuinely significant, and that reveals more about who he was than almost anything else in the record. The 501st Legion, the unit that served under his command, was known across the Grand Army as Torrent Company, Anakin's own. The nickname that followed them through the war was not merely a label of military efficiency. It reflected something specific about how that unit functioned, about the relationship between its general and the men under him. Clone troopers were, by the design of the Republic and the Kaminoans who bred them, soldiers. That was their explicit purpose. They were produced to fight, trained from birth, to follow orders and execute strategy and absorb casualties without the kind of psychological disruption that might compromise their battlefield effectiveness. The Republic treated them as a military resource rather than a population of people. Most Jedi commanders operated within that framework. They cared about their men in the way that any general cares about the effectiveness of their force, with genuine concern for outcomes, but without the kind of specific personal attention that would require seeing each individual soldier as someone irreplaceable. Anakin did not operate within that framework. Anakin learned names, every single one of them, every soldier under his command. He made it his business to know not just their designation, but who they were, what they were good at, what they found funny, what they were afraid of, what they had done in the last engagement that nobody else had noticed but that had made the difference. He attended the deaths of his men in a way that the Jedi Code theoretically discouraged, but that he could not bring himself to perform detachment around. When troopers under his command were killed, he felt it. He allowed himself to feel it. Not performatively, not in a way that disrupted his tactical effectiveness, but genuinely, privately, as an acknowledgement that something real had been lost, that a specific person who had existed in the world was now gone, and that this mattered beyond the strategic calculation of reduced combat effectiveness. He kept track. He did not lose count. He did not allow the deaths to become statistical. His relationship with Captain Rex is one of the most illuminating chapters of his life and one of the most overlooked. Rex was not simply an effective second-in-command in the conventional military sense. He was Anakin's equal in the ways that mattered most in the field. Someone whose judgment he trusted completely, whose instincts he had learned to read, whose perspective he sought, not as a subordinate providing tactical information, but as a partner, thinking through a problem alongside him. They argued. They disagreed with genuine friction and genuine respect, and the easy familiarity of people who had been through enough together that pretense was no longer necessary. Rex called him out when he thought his general was wrong. Anakin listened. He adjusted. He was capable of being told he was wrong by someone technically below him in the chain of command, and actually changing course based on that input, which was not a common quality among people with his level of power, and not something the Jedi training that produced him had specifically prioritized. He was not performing egalitarianism. He genuinely valued Rex's perspective in a way that required treating him as a person whose view of the situation had its own independent weight. This was not accidental. It came from something deep in Anakin's character that traced back to Tatooine, back to the slave quarters of Mos Espa, where the people around him had no power and no status and were no less real for it. He had grown up among people that the Republic did not count, and had learned very early that uncounted people are still people, that the absence of institutional recognition does not diminish the actual weight of a life. The clones were bred, not born, in the conventional sense. They were not citizens. The Republic did not extend to them the protections and recognitions it extended to organic members of its civilization, except insofar as their military function required certain logistical accommodations. Many people, including many Jedi, had quietly absorbed this framing and allowed it to shape how they related to the men under their command. Anakin had not absorbed it. He could not absorb it. It was incompatible with something too fundamental in him to be overwritten by institutional convention. He also bent orders. This is usually discussed in the context of his general relationship to rules and authority, as evidence of the impulsive independence that would eventually become a vulnerability the dark side could exploit. But the specific shape of when and how he bent orders tells a more precise story. He did not bend orders out of arrogance or because he thought his judgment was always better than his commanders. He bent them when following them would require leaving people behind. When the tactical calculus of an engagement required sacrificing soldiers or civilians to preserve the strategic objective, Anakin found ways to avoid making that sacrifice even when the calculation was technically sound. He found third options. He improvised solutions to scenarios that had been presented to him as binary choices. He took on personal risk to avoid leaving anyone in his charge without a path out. This pattern repeated across the Clone Wars with enough consistency to be clearly something other than recklessness. It was a value, a deep and seriously held conviction that the people who had been placed in his care were not expendable. Not even when the math said they were. Not even when the mission required treating them as if they were. There were commanders who found this frustrating. There were engagements where his refusal to accept the standard tactical calculus cost time and resources, and created complications that a more coldly efficient approach would have avoided. These complaints were real. and not entirely wrong on their own terms. But they missed what was actually happening, which was that Anakin Skywalker was conducting himself according to a moral framework that the Republic's military doctrine had not fully thought through, one that treated the men under his command as ends rather than means, that refused to accept the institutional rationalization for treating people as acceptable losses. The irony is enormous. The Jedi Code taught that attachment was dangerous, that caring too specifically for specific individuals was a path toward the dark side. And yet Anakin's attachment to the soldiers in his command produced some of the most genuinely ethical military leadership in the entire war. Leadership shaped by exactly the kind of specific care for specific people that the Code had always told him was his greatest weakness. His relationship with Ahsoka Tano begins with resistance on both sides and becomes one of the most important things that ever happened to either of them, though they would not have put it that way at the time and perhaps could not have, given the specific emotional vocabulary that the Jedi trained its members to use when discussing the things that mattered most to them. Anakin did not want a Padawan. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is not the attitude typically associated with a Jedi who would go on to be described as one of the most influential teachers his Padawan ever had. He was not ready for it. He had not fully worked through his own relationship with the master-apprentice dynamic, had not resolved the things that his training under Obi-Wan had left unfinished, and he understood at some level that the role required something of him that he was not sure he had. Teaching requires a kind of settled knowledge about what you believe and why. Anakin's beliefs were never particularly settled. He believed in protecting people. He believed in fighting for the people next to him. He believed in not leaving anyone behind. These were not the kind of philosophical frameworks the Jedi were asking him to transmit. They wanted him to pass on the code, the traditions, the discipline, the meditative practices that had structured the order for millennia. And Anakin's honest relationship with all of those things was complicated in ways that he was not sure he could convey to a student without corrupting the transmission. Ahsoka arrived anyway, assigned by Yoda, in a move that was either wisdom or provocation, depending on your view of the old master's sense of humor, and Anakin found himself responsible for a 14-year-old Togruta who was confident to the point of recklessness, argumentative, fierce, and in many ways almost recognizably similar to a younger version of himself. He called her Snips almost immediately, a nickname that caught something real about her personality, the sharpness of her, the way she cut through situations rather than navigating around them. She called him Sky Guy, which was either affectionate or lightly mocking, or both. And in the rhythm of those names you can see the shape of what their relationship was going to be. Not formal, not constructed on the architecture of deference and authority that the Jedi template provided. Something more honest and more specific and more genuinely theirs. What Anakin taught Ahsoka was not primarily the code. What he taught her was how to survive. He taught her the gap between what the manual says and what the situation actually requires. He taught her to trust her instincts when the instincts were better than the protocol. He taught her to fight with everything she had, not with the restrained precision of classical Jedi combat, but with the improvised, total commitment ferocity of someone who had learned to fight in circumstances where losing was not an abstract concept. He broke rules with her present and explained why afterward, which was a different kind of teaching than anything the Jedi curriculum prescribed, but possibly more useful for the war they were actually fighting. He disagreed with her openly and changed his mind when she was right, modeling something that he had learned from Rex and that he believed deeply was one of the most important things a person in authority could do. He also worried about her constantly. This is not something that gets discussed in the context of his teaching because it does not fit the conventional image of the Jedi Master, composed and equanimous, guiding the Padawan from a position of settled authority. Anakin's anxiety about Ahsoka was not detached concern. It was personal. When she was in danger, which was frequently, given the nature of the war and the nature of Ahsoka, he reacted with an urgency that went beyond tactical concern for the mission outcome. He needed her to be safe in a way that was specific and felt, and not at all compatible with the Jedi's official position on what attachment was supposed to look like. He would have said, if asked, that he was responsible for her, that she was his Padawan, and her safety was his mission. And that would have been true. It would also have been incomplete. The truth was that he cared about Ahsoka the way you care about someone who has become important to you as an individual, someone whose specific existence in the world has acquired a weight that goes beyond their functional role in your life. He was attached to her. The code had been telling him his entire career that this was the thing he was most supposed to avoid. He could not stop himself, and for a long time at least, the results of that attachment were not darkness, but protection and dedication, and the kind of teaching that actually reaches the student rather than simply instructing them. She pushed him. This is easy to overlook because the age and experience differential makes it seem like the relationship's direction of influence should have been primarily one way. Anakin taught Ahsoka. That is the formal arrangement. But Ahsoka also taught Anakin things that he had not managed to learn from anyone else, things about his own patterns that he could see from inside his relationship with her, in ways that he could not see from inside his other relationships. She reflected him back to himself in a form he could actually read. Her impulsiveness helped him see his own impulsiveness, not with the shame and defensiveness that he brought to his awareness of the same quality in himself, but with something more like rueful recognition. Her fierce protectiveness of the people she cared about was recognizable to him not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a value he shared, and perhaps had not fully given himself permission to simply have. She was the first relationship in his adult life that was not organized around either his authority over her or her authority over him in ways that created an emotional debt. She needed things from him, yes, but she also gave things back. And the specific things she gave back were not things Obi-Wan could give, were not things Padme could give, were not things Rex could give, though Rex came closest. They were the things you get from someone who knows you not as a symbol or a hero or a legend or a husband or a general, but as the specific, imperfect person you actually are, who has watched you make mistakes from close enough to see them clearly and continued to show up anyway. The mission to Felucia in the early days of the war is one small example of a pattern that repeated across their time together. Anakin had been ordered to withdraw from an engagement that the Republic command had determined was unwinnable at acceptable cost. The order was tactically reasonable. The theater of operations had shifted. Supply lines were compromised, and holding the position would have required committing resources that were needed elsewhere. The correct response from a purely strategic standpoint was to execute the withdrawal efficiently and move on. Anakin withdrew his forces but left channels open that he had not been authorized to leave open, maintained intelligence assets in the region at personal political risk, and returned to the engagement under different operational parameters before the official withdrawal was complete. He did this because there were civilians in the area whose situation the withdrawal calculus had not fully accounted for. And because Ahsoka had seen something in the local situation that suggested the standard assessment was missing a relevant variable, he trusted her read. He adjusted. He accepted the consequences of the adjustment when they came. This pattern, variations of it, played out across the war in theater after theater. He was not insubordinate in the broad sense of simply disregarding his orders whenever they inconvenienced him. He was insubordinate in the specific sense of being unable to close his eyes to the things that the standard military calculation required him to close his eyes to. There is a difference, and it matters. Ahsoka absorbed all of it. The rules he broke and the reasons he broke them. The discipline he brought to the things that deserved discipline, and the contempt he brought to the things that deserved contempt. The specific way he moved through a battlefield, simultaneously aware of the tactical picture and of every individual person caught within it, never losing either level of awareness to the other. She became extraordinarily good, in part because she had an extraordinary teacher, but also in part because she had a teacher who taught from a place of genuine investment rather than professional obligation. He wanted her to be good. He wanted her to survive. He wanted her to become someone who could take care of herself and the people around her in the brutal world the war had made. And he put everything he had into that project, without reservation, and without the kind of careful emotional management that the Jedi Code suggested he should bring to the Master-Padawan relationship. He was all the way in. And for the years that they were together, that totality of investment produced something remarkable in both directions. Then the Jedi Order falsely accused her of bombing the temple. Then they expelled her. Then they put her on trial for a crime she had not committed, with the kind of institutional certainty that large organizations mistake for justice when they are afraid and need someone to hold accountable for something frightening that has happened to them. She was 17 years old. She had spent 3 years fighting their war, bleeding for their cause, taking every risk they had asked of her, and several they had not. And when something went wrong that had nothing to do with her, they expelled her and prepared to hand her to the Republic Senate for execution. Not privately wrong, publicly, officially, institutionally wrong. The Jedi Order was wrong about Ahsoka Tano in a way that cost a 17-year-old girl her home, her identity, and very nearly her life. Anakin's response to this is one of the most revealing things in the entire record of his life. He did not accept the Council's judgment. He did not perform the equanimity that the situation technically called for. He investigated. He went outside the channels that the institution provided, identified the real culprit, produced the evidence that cleared her name, and presented it to the Council in a way that made unmistakably clear that he understood exactly what had happened and what it meant. The Council had been wrong. The Order had failed her. He had been right to question it, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He stood next to Ahsoka in that moment with a completeness of support that the record does not always give him credit for. He fought for her with the same totality of investment with which he had taught her, and then she walked away. She stood in that corridor, and she looked at the Council, and she looked at Anakin, and she told him that she could not go back, that what had happened had changed something fundamental for her about the Order and about her place in it. She handed him her lightsabers, and she left. And Anakin stood there with her lightsabers in his hands, and he watched her go. He let her go, because he understood her well enough to understand that stopping her would not have been protecting her. It would have been keeping her for himself. And that was not something he was willing to do. He loved her enough to let her make the choice that was right for her, even though it was not the choice he would have made for her, and even though it cost him something real and significant and not easily replaced. What that moment did to him internally is not something the record gives us directly. He did not speak at length about it in any account that survived. What we can see is the shape of what was left behind. Ahsoka had been one of the few genuine constants in the chaos of the war years. Someone who knew him specifically, who had watched him be wrong and imperfect and still chosen to stay, who had not required him to perform a version of himself that fit the institutional expectations. When she left, he lost not just a Padawan, but one of the very small number of people in his life who had been willing to see him whole. And the number of people willing to do that was already small enough that losing any one of them mattered in a way that could not be easily compensated for by the others. The Jedi Council's handling of the Ahsoka situation clarified something for Anakin that he had been carrying in unformed ways for years. The Order was not simply an imperfect institution doing its best in difficult circumstances, which would have been a bearable truth. It was an institution capable of genuine injustice, of looking at one of its own members and deciding that institutional self-preservation was more important than whether that member was actually guilty. It was an institution that had mechanisms for being wrong, and no adequate mechanisms for accountability when it was. The Council apologized to Ahsoka after the truth came out. They offered to reinstate her. They offered her the rank of Jedi Knight without the completion of her trials. A significant honor that was also, in the way of institutional apologies, fundamentally insufficient to the scale of what had been done to her. They were sorry. They were sorry in the way that powerful institutions are sorry when they have been caught being what they are, with sincerity, but without the structural self-examination that would prevent the same thing from happening again. Anakin saw all of this clearly. He saw it, and he filed it alongside everything else the institution had given him to file. The early rejection, the decade of being told his emotions were a problem, the years of performing a version of himself that had never quite fit, the accumulated experience of an order that had wanted the power he represented, without being entirely sure it wanted the person that power came attached to. He did not break from them at that moment. He was not ready to break from them, and in some fundamental sense he never became ready, never made a clean decision to leave rather than being pulled in a different direction by a force larger than himself. But something shifted. Something that had already been under stress took a new weight, and the structure was not as sound as it had appeared from the outside. There was another Anakin that nobody discussed in the council chambers or the war briefings or the political conversations about the Chosen One and the fate of the Republic. There was the Anakin who came alive around machines, not in the way the term is sometimes used to describe technical competence, the ability to interface with mechanical systems efficiently. Something more than that, and less legible to the outside world. Anakin genuinely loved machines in the way some people love music, with an attention and a pleasure that went beyond function into something closer to aesthetic experience. He could walk into an engine room or a hangar or a workshop and immediately begin perceiving the space in a way that was different from how he perceived almost anything else. The machines told him things, not in any mystical or force-connected sense, though his force sensitivity certainly deepened the accuracy of his perceptions. But in the same way that a master craftsman reads a piece of wood or a musician hears interval relationships that an untrained listener will miss, he had built enough things from scratch to understand intuitively how anything mechanical was supposed to work, which meant that the gap between how it was working and how it should be working was immediately apparent to him in ways that experienced engineers sometimes found disorienting. He did not need to run diagnostics. He could hear it. The starfighter was the clearest expression of this. In the cockpit, Anakin Skywalker was in a state that he could not access anywhere else. Not in meditation, which he was notoriously poor at, despite years of practice. Not in council chambers. Not in political meetings. Not even, entirely, in combat, where the tactical requirements of the situation created a kind of urgency that kept some part of his mind in problem-solving mode rather than in the present moment. In the cockpit, everything else went quiet. The fear about the future, and the grief about the past, and the weight of the prophecy, and the expectations of the order, and the secret of his marriage, and the political complexity of the war, and the question of what was going to happen to his mother, and the question of what was going to happen to Padme, and the question of what was going to happen to him, all of it receded. In the cockpit, there was only the ship and the space and the immediate geometry of whatever was in front of him, and he was completely sufficient to that geometry. He was made for it. Whatever the Force had put together when it assembled Anakin Skywalker, it had put together something that belonged in the air, with the kind of belonging that did not require any justification or any special circumstances, the way a fish belongs in water, not because it has been trained to swim there, but because that is simply what it is. He flew with a joy that was almost embarrassingly pure for someone who had been told his whole life that joy needed to be tempered by wisdom and attachment needed to be held at arm's length, and pleasure in earthly things was a distraction from the higher work of the Force. He loved flying the way he had loved it as a boy in Mos Espa, with the same uncomplicated delight that nobody had ever managed to educate out of him, no matter how many hours they had put into the project. And in this one place, the Jedi Code had simply failed to reach him. The attachment was complete, and it harmed no one, and it gave him back to himself every time he was in the air in a way that nothing else could. He was never more Anakin and never less Vader in progress than when he was in a cockpit. The armor could not have flown the way he flew. The armor could not have felt what he felt up there. Whatever eventually became of him, the boy from Tatooine who had looked up at twin moons and known that he was going to be among the stars one day, was never entirely extinguished. He kept flying. He kept loving it. He kept being, in that specific context, free in the only way that had ever felt entirely natural to him. The engineers who worked with him over the years noticed something that the formal record does not emphasize, but that surfaces consistently in personal accounts from the Clone Wars era. He modified things, not because he had been assigned to upgrade equipment or because the modification was strategically necessary, but because he saw a better way and could not resist making it actual. He would identify inefficiencies in his starfighter systems during a mission and fix them himself before the debrief was over. He would notice something about a piece of equipment that his men were using that was causing it to underperform and quietly adapt it during a downtime period between engagements. He gave those modifications to anyone who needed them. He did not keep them as advantages for himself. He found the problem, solved it, and distributed the solution. The same impulse that had built a protocol droid from junk for his mother when he was 7, scaled up to the resources available to a Jedi general in the field. The machine mind and the generous impulse were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. What this tells us, taken together with everything else, is that Anakin Skywalker was not a person whose inner life was primarily organized around power. This is the reading of him that the fall makes seem inevitable in retrospect. The idea that his hunger for capability and control was always the dominant feature, that the rest of his personality was decoration around a core that was fundamentally about wanting to be strong enough that nothing could be taken from him. This reading is not entirely wrong. The hunger for power over death, the terror of loss that drove him toward any solution that promised to prevent it. These things are real and they matter. But they are not the whole picture, and they are not the primary picture. The primary picture is a person who built things for other people, who learned names nobody asked him to learn, who flew not because it made him powerful, but because it made him happy, who taught a student by being genuinely invested in her rather than by efficiently transmitting the institutional curriculum, who bent military orders not to satisfy his ego but to keep specific people from being left behind. The hunger was real, but so was the generosity. And the generosity was there first. Palpatine saw all of this before anyone else did. This is the part of the story that is most important to understand clearly, because it is the part most frequently explained away as Anakin's weakness, as evidence of the character flaw that made him susceptible, as though what happened between them was a story about Anakin's failure to be sufficiently guarded, rather than a story about a predator's extraordinary patience and skill. Palpatine spent somewhere between 10 and 15 years constructing a relationship with Anakin Skywalker that was designed from the beginning to occupy the specific emotional territory that nobody else in Anakin's life was willing or able to occupy. He did not rush. He did not overplay his hand. He moved slowly and with the kind of precision that only someone who had spent centuries studying the mechanics of psychological influence could have managed, building something that felt entirely natural, because it was assembled piece by careful piece from Anakin's most genuine and unguarded needs. He listened. This sounds simple, and it is, in the sense that the technique itself is not complicated. But in the context of Anakin's life, in which almost every relationship of significance was organized around someone telling him what he should feel or think or do with what he felt and thought, a person who simply listened without immediately redirecting was extraordinary. Palpatine never told Anakin his feelings were wrong. He never suggested that Anakin's fear of loss was a flaw to be corrected, or that his love for Padme was a violation of principle rather than a fundamental human reality. He validated. He affirmed. He sat with Anakin in the emotional experiences that the rest of Anakin's world could not accommodate, and he did it consistently and without apparent agenda, which meant that by the time the agenda became visible, it was far too late to undo what had been built. Anakin trusted him, not naively, not without some instinctive awareness that this man was complicated and his affections might not be entirely what they appeared to be. He trusted him the way people trust the one person in their life who has never flinched from what they actually are. You cannot easily distrust someone who has absorbed your worst moments and remained. Palpatine had absorbed all of them. He had positioned himself as the one stable reference point in a life of almost constant instability. And when the moment came that everything else was falling apart, he was still there, still listening, still offering the one thing Anakin had never been able to find in adequate supply anywhere else. The love he had for Padme deserves to be considered on its own terms before we get to what it ultimately cost them both. It is frequently analyzed in the context of the fall, as a vulnerability that was exploited, as an attachment that violated the Jedi Code, and therefore set the stage for everything that followed. All of that is true, and none of it is the whole story. The whole story is that Anakin Skywalker fell in love with a person in a way that was entirely consistent with who he was, deeply and totally, and without the emotional reservations that might have made the love safer for everyone involved. He loved her the way he did everything that mattered to him, completely, with the full weight of a self that had always been too large for the container the Order provided. And she loved him back in a way that was genuine and complicated, and that had its own psychological terrain worth understanding. A woman of enormous capability and conviction who saw in him something that the public image of the heroic Jedi general did not fully capture, who chose to be present with the actual person rather than the legend. They were not a tragedy because their love was a mistake. They were a tragedy because the world they lived in had no place for what they were to each other, and the effort of hiding it, and the fear of losing it, combined with everything else to create a pressure that neither of them had the support structure to bear. This is where part one ends, not at the fall, not at the moment of decision, not at the operating table, or the mask, or the first mechanical breath. It ends here, in the middle of everything, with a man who is still fully himself, still building and flying and learning names and bending orders and loving people with a completeness that the world around him has never quite known what to do with. The fall is coming. It is always coming, but it has not arrived yet. And in the space before it arrives, this is who he was. There are moments across the Clone Wars that almost nobody talks about because they do not fit cleanly into either the heroic arc or the tragedy arc, and the story of Anakin Skywalker has always been told as though it has to be one or the other. Moments where he came extraordinarily close to a different outcome. Not close in the dramatic sense of a near miss that the audience is meant to feel relief at surviving, but close in the quieter and more unsettling sense of a person standing at a genuine fork in a road, feeling both directions with equal clarity, choosing one and moving on, and never quite leaving the other one entirely behind. These moments are real, and they matter, and they are almost entirely absent from the popular understanding of his story, in part because they complicate the tragedy narrative, and in part because they require sitting with an Anakin who is more than a cautionary tale, a person genuinely trying to find a livable way through an impossible set of circumstances, failing not because he was doomed to fail, but because the support he needed was never available in the form he needed it. The earliest and in many ways the most significant of these near turns happens not during the war but before it, in the desert again, at the moment of his mother's death. What happened at the Tusken camp is usually discussed as the first real evidence of the darkness in him. The moment the fall becomes inevitable in retrospect, the night Anakin Skywalker crossed a line from which there was no return. And it is true that what he did there was real and terrible and something he would have to live with for the rest of his life. He killed. He killed not just the Tuskens who had held his mother, but every living thing in that camp. Men and women and children, in a rage that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with a grief so total that it annihilated the part of him that was supposed to maintain the distinction between combatants and bystanders, between the people responsible for what had happened and the people who simply happened to be present. It was not a Jedi act. It was not even a human act, in the sense that humanity requires some minimum level of access to reason and proportion. It was a boy who had come too late to save his mother screaming through a lightsaber and then having to sit with the silence afterward. What is less discussed is what he did immediately after. He sat with her body. He carried her out of that camp and he brought her home, back to Lars Moisture Farm, back to the people who had been her family in the years since he left, and he sat with his grief in the dark and said the true thing out loud to Padme, because she was the only one who could hear it. He told her what he had done. He did not hide it, did not frame it as a tactical necessity or a protective action, or any of the rationalizations that might have made it more bearable to sit with. He said he had killed them all and he was not sorry, and he hated himself for not being sorry, and he wanted to be better than this, and he did not know if he was. This is not the behavior of someone who has fully and irreversibly embraced the dark side in that moment. This is the behavior of someone in profound moral crisis, aware of what they have done, aware of the gap between who they did it and who they want to be, desperate for something that the situation cannot provide. He was not Vader yet. He was Anakin at the worst moment of his life, trying to find his way back to himself and not quite managing it. The conversation with Padme that followed is one of the most important in the saga and one of the least examined. She did not tell him what he had done was right. She did not provide absolution or excuse or minimize. She stayed. She stayed with the full weight of what he had told her, with what it meant about him and about the situation and about the specific kind of danger he was in. And she did not go anywhere. This is not a trivial thing. Most people, confronted with that confession, would have moved, would have created distance, would have found a way to reframe their relationship with this person in terms that gave them more safety and less proximity to what had just been revealed. Padme moved toward him. She held the information and she held him, and she stayed because she had decided that this specific person, in this specific agony, was still the person she had chosen. And the agony did not change that calculation. This is what love looks like when it is operating at its most genuine and most difficult. Not the easy warmth of loving someone who is behaving well, but the harder and more costly thing of staying present with someone who has just shown you something true and frightening about themselves. She gave him back to himself that night. Not fully, not without cost, but she pulled him towards something human, when the pull in the other direction had been enormous. He came back from that night, still damaged, still carrying the weight of what he had done, but still Anakin, still reaching toward a version of himself that was better than the desert, still trying. He tried for the next 3 years. The war gave him less time to think, which was probably both a mercy and a danger, and he threw himself into it with the totality that characterized everything he committed to. He fought, and he protected, and he flew, and he led, and he grieved, and he loved in secret, and he came home to Padme whenever the war allowed it, and he sat with her in the darkness of their apartment on Coruscant, and was, in those moments, more fully himself than anywhere else. The secret was both a burden and a shelter. A burden because it required constant performance, constant maintenance of a version of himself designed for external consumption, constant vigilance against the slip that would expose what he had. A shelter because inside the secret, there was a space that belonged entirely to them. A room in his life where the code and the war and the prophecy and the council's reservations about him had no jurisdiction, where he was not the chosen one or the hero with no fear or the best general the Order had produced in a generation. He was just Anakin. He was just a person who loved someone and was trying to build something that would last. The pregnancy changed everything. Not because it introduced a new complication into an already complicated situation, though it did, but because of what Anakin's response to it revealed about where he actually was psychologically by that point in the war. A person in a sound internal state, receiving the news that they were going to become a parent, might experience fear alongside the joy. Fear is reasonable. Becoming a parent is significant, and the circumstances were not straightforward, and fear was an appropriate response. But Anakin's response was not primarily fear about the circumstances. It was terror, the specific kind of terror that has already decided how the story ends and is living in that ending, rather than in the actual present moment. He began dreaming almost immediately. Not idle, anxious dreams, but vivid and specific premonitory visions of the kind that his Force sensitivity had given him before, and that had proven accurate before. And what he saw in them was Padme dying in childbirth, dying in pain, dying before he could reach her, dying while he watched helplessly the way he had watched Shmi die in that Tusken camp while he held her, and she slipped away regardless. The echo between those two losses, the mother who died before he could save her, and the vision of the wife who was going to die the same way, was not subtle, and he could not miss it. He was not afraid of an abstract future. He was afraid of something that had already happened to him once, something that had broken him once, happening again in a form that felt indistinguishable from inevitable. This is where Palpatine's campaign reached its final stage. He had spent a decade and a half preparing for this. He had cultivated a relationship of trust and emotional intimacy that was entirely unmatched by anything else in Anakin's life. He had positioned himself as the one adult in the room who had never told Anakin his feelings were wrong, who had sat with his anger and his fear and his love and his grief, and responded not with redirection, but with the warm, unhurried attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. He had been patient with a patience that was not natural to him, but that he had constructed deliberately and maintained carefully because he understood what it was building toward. And now, the moment was here. Anakin was dreaming about Padme's death. He was terrified in a way that bypassed all the years of Jedi training that was supposed to give him tools for sitting with uncertainty. He was reaching for anything that might make the vision untrue. And Palpatine had the answer. He was the only one who had an answer. He told Anakin about Darth Plagueis. He told him that the dark side contained knowledge powerful enough to prevent death. He said it in the intimate darkness of an opera house, with the music playing below them and the rest of the world entirely absent, in a tone that suggested he was offering something precious and personal, and not to be shared. Something meant specifically for Anakin, because Anakin specifically needed it. It was a perfect delivery. It had been years in the making. And it worked not because Anakin was foolish, or because his love for Padme was a weakness, or because the dark side had been patiently eroding his defenses. It worked because a man who had been groomed for 15 years by someone who understood exactly how to use trust as a weapon was always going to be vulnerable to the moment that trust was weaponized. He did not walk into it. He was walked into it, step by careful step, across more than a decade, by someone who had been planning this moment since Anakin was a child. The events of Revenge of the Sith move fast, and they are meant to. The tragedy requires momentum. If you slow it down and examine each individual moment, you find a person making a series of decisions that each make a certain kind of terrible sense from inside the specific pressure he is under, even as the cumulative direction of those decisions leads somewhere that could not be walked back. He goes to Palpatine after the battle over Coruscant to report on the Chancellor's location, because that is what his duty requires, and Palpatine reveals himself as a Sith Lord, and Anakin does the thing that the heroic narrative might not have predicted. He goes to Mace Windu. He tells the truth. He walks directly to the one member of the council whose judgment he trusts most, and he tells him that the man he has been closest to for 15 years, the man who has functioned as something approaching a father, is a Sith Lord who has been manipulating the Republic from inside. He turns him in. He does this knowing what it means. He does this knowing that Palpatine is the only person who has ever offered him the specific thing he is most desperate for, the possibility of keeping Padme alive. And he turns him in anyway, whatever his fears and his conflicts, and the years of doubt about the Council. In that moment, he does the right thing. He chooses the Jedi. He chooses the Republic. He chooses to betray the one person who claimed to offer salvation, because the alternative was to betray everything else he had been. And then the vision happens. He arrives at Palpatine's office to find Mace Windu with a lightsaber at the Chancellor's throat. And Palpatine is beaten and frail and claiming that the Jedi have come to kill him. And Mace is making the case in real time that this man needs to die before he can recover, and that this is justice rather than execution. And Anakin stands in that doorway and watches the two forces of his life facing each other. The order that has shaped him and frustrated him and doubted him for 20 years, and the man who has listened to him and believed in him and never told him his feelings were wrong. And Palpatine, in that moment, says something that cuts through every other calculation. He says Anakin is his only hope. He says, if Anakin does not intervene, he will die. And Anakin's ability to save Padme will die with him. And Anakin makes the worst decision of his life, not because he has been corrupted into cruelty or because the dark side has convinced him that power matters more than people. He makes it because he is standing in a doorway between two things he loves, and one of them is about to kill the other. And the one being killed is the only one who has ever said he can save the person he loves most in the world. He cuts off Mace Windu's hand. He does not even fully understand, in the moment he does it, what he has just done. The understanding comes a few seconds later, when Palpatine kills Mace, when the body falls from that window into the Coruscant night, and Anakin looks at what the last several seconds have produced and says, out loud, "What have I done?" He knows. He knows immediately and completely. He does not dress it up or rationalize it. In the moment of recognition, he says, out loud, "What have I done?" And the answer is present in the silence that follows. He has killed a Jedi Master. He has completed a Sith Lord's plan. He has ended the possibility of the life he was trying to save. He has made himself, in the space of a few seconds, into something he cannot undo. The decision to pledge himself to Palpatine after that moment is not a decision made from desire. It is a decision made from the total absence of alternatives. He has just betrayed the Jedi Order in a way that cannot be explained or forgiven. He cannot walk back into the temple and take his place among them. He has closed that door definitively with the removal of Mace Windu's hand. The only thing still potentially reachable is the promise that Palpatine made. The dark side knowledge that might save Padme, the one door that has not yet been closed. He walks through it, not because it is what he wanted, but because it is all that is left. And Palpatine, who understood this perfectly, who had designed this exact situation across 15 years of careful work, gives him a new name, Darth Vader. As though naming a thing creates it. As though the act of renaming erases the previous contents. As though Anakin Skywalker, who built a droid for his mother and learned his soldiers' names and loved a woman with his whole heart and cried alone about the things he had done, can be simply retitled into someone else. He cannot. And this is the part that almost nobody talks about. The armor came, and the mask came, and the mechanical breathing came, and the dark side came. And Darth Vader was real as anything he became, genuinely terrifying, and genuinely committed to what he had chosen in ways that cannot be minimized or made comfortable. But Anakin Skywalker was also still real. He persisted, not as a warm undercurrent visible to everyone he encountered, not as a gentleness lurking beneath the surface of the Empire's enforcer, but as a presence in him that the dark side could suppress and could weaponize and could use but could not eliminate. He was still there, and across more than 20 years of the Empire, there are moments, specific and observable moments, where he shows through the armor in ways that the Vader narrative cannot fully account for. He never stopped flying. This is a small thing, and also not a small thing. The Empire gave Darth Vader access to the most advanced starfighters in the galaxy, and he flew them with the same complete and uncomplicated mastery that Anakin Skywalker had brought to every cockpit he had ever occupied. He flew with a skill that his pilots found disorienting. Not because it was aggressive or intimidating, though it was both, but because it was also beautiful in a way that seemed inconsistent with the figure in the black armor. The Imperial Navy pilots who flew alongside him described a commander who flew with something beyond tactical precision, something that looked, from the outside, almost like pleasure. They did not have the context to understand what they were seeing. What they were seeing was the one thing that had always been entirely his. The one thing the years of war and the trauma and the dark side and the armor had not been able to take from him. In the cockpit, he was still himself. The darkness was real, but so was this. He sought out Obi-Wan Kenobi with an obsession that the Empire never fully explained and that Vader himself never fully articulated. The official narrative was that Kenobi was a threat, a surviving Jedi who represented a loose end from the Purge, someone whose continued existence was an affront to the order of the new Empire. All of that was true in the operational sense, and none of it was the real reason. The real reason was more complicated and more human and less convenient for either the Vader mythology or the simple reading of what their relationship had been. He wanted to find him because Obi-Wan Kenobi was the person who had known him best and longest among all the people still alive, the person who carried more of the history of who Anakin Skywalker had been than almost anyone else in the galaxy. Finding him was, in ways that Vader could not have straightforwardly admitted even to himself, a form of reaching backward, an attempt to locate something that had been lost. The fury and the grief in his pursuit of Obi-Wan were not two separate things. They were the same thing expressed in the only language the armor allowed. He was angry at Obi-Wan for the desert on Mustafar, for leaving him burning at the edge of the lava river, for choosing to let him burn rather than kill him cleanly. He was angry in the specific way you are angry at someone you have loved. where the love and the fury are both proportional to the same thing and cannot be separated from each other without destroying the evidence. He hated him and he missed him, and those two things had been knotted together for more than a decade, and the knot would not loosen. The Emperor understood this. He was not a man who missed anything useful, and Vader's attachment to the memory of Anakin Skywalker was useful to him in ways that required understanding it clearly. He kept Vader oriented toward the future, toward projects and campaigns, and the ongoing work of consolidating the Empire's power, because a Vader pointed forward had less attention to spend on what he had been before. When the attention turned backward, when the grief and the loss and the specific human weight of what had happened began to surface, Palpatine had mechanisms for redirecting it. Pain, usually. Physical pain as a reset, a way of interrupting the internal process before it could reach a conclusion that might threaten the architecture of control he had spent so long building. The armor was partly a tool of this. It was not only a life support system or a symbol of terror, though it was both. It was also a cage, a mechanism for ensuring that the person inside it was perpetually at the edge of physical endurance, perpetually dependent on the machinery that kept him alive, perpetually unable to access the stillness that reflection requires. You cannot sit quietly in that suit. The suit does not permit quiet. The suit is always working, always compensating, always reminding its occupant that breathing is not automatic and life is not given, but maintained by technology that can be taken away. Palpatine had put Anakin into a body that would never let him forget what had happened to it and never let him rest long enough to fully process it. Luke Skywalker grew up not knowing his father's name. He grew up on Tatooine, on the same planet, in the same desert, at the edge of the same twin sun horizon, raised by Owen and Beru Lars, who had known Shmi, who had welcomed Anakin back with her body the night of the Tusken camp, who understood what lived in that family's history and had decided to protect the child from it for as long as they could. Luke did not know. He knew that his father had been a pilot, that he had been something, that Owen's reluctance to discuss him meant there was something to protect him from. He built the absence into a mythology, the way children build mythologies out of the gaps in their knowledge, making the unknown father into something he could carry without being crushed by the weight of what it actually was. He wanted to be like him. He said so more than once, to the sky above the Lars homestead in the hours before the twin suns set. He did not know what he was asking for. He did not know that the thing he was reaching toward across all that distance was already reaching back in the only ways available to it. The first time Vader became aware of Luke's existence as a specific individual rather than a tactical variable, something shifted. The record is imprecise about the exact mechanism, about what exactly moved in him when the name Skywalker surfaced in the context of the destruction of the Death Star. What is clear is that the response was not what you would expect from a purely tactical calculation. He did not simply reorient his resources toward eliminating a new rebel asset. He became personally invested in a way that the Emperor noticed and that Vader himself did not fully explain, or perhaps did not fully understand. The name carried everything. It was his name. First, the name he had given up, or had taken from him, or had replaced, depending on how you read that moment in Palpatine's office. It was the name his son was carrying. His son he had not known. He had believed, for more than 20 years, that the child had died with Padme, that the dream of Padme dying in childbirth had been precisely the prophecy it appeared to be, that the person he had sold himself to the dark side in order to save had died anyway, and taken with her everything that might have been, and she had, in the most terrible possible sense, died anyway, and the galaxy had gone dark around that fact. And now there was a son who was alive, a son who had a name that connected him to everything Anakin Skywalker had been before the armor. What Vader did with this information is, again, not simple. He pursued Luke the way he had pursued Obi-Wan, with an intensity that exceeded tactical logic. But the quality of the pursuit was different. With Obi-Wan, there had been rage and grief knotted together. With Luke, there was something else, something that the dark side could not fully colonize because it was connected to a part of him that predated the dark side, and that the dark side had been unable to reach even across 20 years of effort. He wanted to find Luke, not to destroy him, but to turn him, to bring him to the Emperor's side, to create from the wreckage of what had happened something that could persist into the future. This is the official reading, and it is not wrong. But beneath the official reading is something more honest. He wanted to know him. He wanted to see the person that had existed in the galaxy for more than 20 years without his knowledge. The person who carried his name and apparently his talent for flying and his connection to the Force and some other things perhaps that had come from somewhere in him that the armor had not managed to contain. The Cloud City on Bespin is where the truth comes out. In a corridor, at the end of a lightsaber duel that has gone further than either of them intended, and left Luke with one fewer hand, and a certainty that he would rather fall than be taken. Vader reaches across the shaft and says the thing that cannot be unsaid. He says, "I am your father." He says it not as a threat or a tactical maneuver. He says it as a truth that has been contained too long, that he has been carrying through the dark corridors of the Empire for however long he has known it, and that has been pressing toward the light with a force that no amount of dark side discipline could permanently suppress. He says it and offers his hand. He says, "Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son." The words are the words of a Sith Lord. The gesture is the gesture of a father. Both things are simultaneously true, and the simultaneity is the most honest account of who he is in that moment. Still Vader, and still, underneath, the person who had always moved toward protecting the people he loved, even when everything else in him was pulling in another direction. Luke falls rather than take his hand, and Vader lets him fall. This is not a detail the story lingers on, but it matters. He could have caught him. He did not catch him. He watched him drop into the shaft and made no move to stop it, and then stood alone in the corridor with the truth still in the air between them and no one to receive it. He had told the truth and been refused, and he did not punish the refusal. He did not pursue. He stood in the corridor, and he was, for a moment, neither a Sith Lord, nor a symbol, nor a weapon of the Empire. He was a father who had just told his son something important and watched his son choose to fall rather than hear it. The grief in that moment is not something the armor shows, but it is there. It is there because it has always been there. Because Anakin Skywalker was never someone whose grief went anywhere. It only accumulated, and by this point in his life, it was so heavy and so old that even the dark side could not carry it cleanly. There are 3 years between Bespin and the forest moon of Endor. And during those 3 years, Vader does something that the official record frames as tactical preparation. But that reads, in the light of everything else, as something more like waiting. He knows Luke will come back. He knows it with a certainty that goes beyond tactical assessment and into the territory of feeling. The same territory his force sensitivity had always navigated with a precision that no instrument could match. He has been waiting his entire adult life for something he could not name. Some resolution to the accumulation of everything that had happened. Some moment where the pressure would either break him completely or find a release that meant something. He suspects, perhaps, that Luke is that release. He does not act on the suspicion in any way that would make it visible to the Emperor, but he waits. He maintains the appearance of the Empire's instrument, and he waits for his son to come back. Luke surrenders to the Empire on Endor. He surrenders because he believes that the good in his father is real and reachable, and that his willingness to stand in front of it, without weapons, is the thing most likely to reach it. Every person in Luke's life who has relevant knowledge has told him that Vader is gone, that Anakin Skywalker is dead, that what is left is not a person to be reasoned with, but a darkness to be avoided or destroyed. Obi-Wan said it in those specific terms. Yoda, in his way, said it. The rebel leadership considered it settled. Luke did not accept it. He did not accept it, not because he was naive or because he was being sentimental about a father he had never known. He did not accept it because he had stood in a corridor on a cloud city and felt something on the other side of a raised hand, something that was not entirely the dark side, something that reached toward him even in the moment of offering him exactly the wrong thing. He had felt it, and he had chosen to fall rather than take the hand. And he had been thinking about that choice for 3 years. He was going back to find out if what he felt had been real. The Emperor's throne room is where the story resolves. Not where it ends, because stories this size do not end cleanly, but where the central question of it finally gets its answer. Palpatine has Luke in front of him, and he is doing what he has always done, using the truth as a weapon, using the real consequences of the Rebel Alliance's position and the apparent hopelessness of Luke's situation to produce the despair that turns a Jedi toward the dark side. He wants Luke to strike him down in anger. He wants the lightning to come. He knows that rage is the door. He has opened it before. He is very good at opening it. And Luke is close. He can feel it in Luke the way he could feel it in Anakin, the specific frequency of someone who loves too much and fears too much and is standing at the edge of acting on both simultaneously. He watches Luke's hand tighten on the lightsaber, and he smiles the way he has always smiled at that moment. The thin, private satisfaction of someone who has seen this scene before and knows exactly how it goes. Vader is watching too. He is standing at the edge of the room in the armor, in the suit that has not allowed him to rest since Mustafar, watching his master work on his son the way his master has worked on everyone, finding the pressure point and pressing it. And something moves in him, something that has been moving for 3 years, quietly, in the spaces between missions and campaigns, and the grinding work of maintaining the Empire's order, something that has been building since Bespin, and perhaps since before Bespin, since the moment a name surfaced in a rebel report and changed the calculation of everything. He watches the lightning start. He watches his son screaming on the floor. He watches Palpatine watching his son scream, with the particular quality of attention that Vader knows from decades of proximity. The attention of someone who is using pain the way he has always used it, as a tool, as a mechanism of control, as a source of the energy that sustains him. He has seen this before. He has been on the receiving end of this. He knows exactly what it is and what it produces and where it leads. He picks up the Emperor. This is the moment. Not a dramatic gesture, not a battle, not a confrontation of equals where light side and dark side measure themselves against each other in some grand cosmic reckoning. He picks up the Emperor and he carries him to the edge of the shaft and he throws him in. The act requires enormous physical effort because the suit is damaged and the lightning has done things to the systems that maintain his life. And he does it anyway, with the totality that has always characterized everything he committed to. He does not hesitate. He does not calculate. He sees his son on the floor, and he sees the person hurting his son. And he does the thing that Anakin Skywalker has always done, the thing that Tatooine built into him and slavery could not remove, and the Jedi Code could not contain, and 23 years of the dark side could not extinguish. He puts himself between the person he loves and the thing that is hurting them. He protects. He has always protected, even when everything else about him was twisted and weaponized and turned against the things he valued. This remained. The instinct that had bent military orders and learned soldiers' names and investigated an unjust accusation and cut off Mace Windu's hand in a doorway and reached across a shaft to a son he had just found. The instinct to move toward the person you love when they are in danger, regardless of the cost to yourself. The cost this time is final. The lightning has done what the years of the suit and the dark side could not entirely do on their own. He is dying. He knows it with the clarity that the Force gives to endings, the same clarity that let him feel things before they happened his entire life, now turned toward the last thing he will feel. He asks Luke to take off the mask. He wants to see him with his own eyes before he goes, not through the suit's sensors, but with the actual apparatus of his own face, the face that has been sealed away for 23 years, the face that Padme last saw, the face of Anakin Skywalker. Luke takes off the mask, and Vader looks at his son with his own eyes for the first and last time, and he tells him that Luke was right. He tells him there was good in him after all. He is not asking for absolution. He is not offering a theological accounting of his life's actions. He is telling his son a true thing before he dies. He was right. There was good in him. It never left. It was buried under decades of armor and pain and darkness and guilt and the specific horror of what he had done to himself and everyone else. But it never left. The boy who built a droid for his mother in the desert was still in there. The general who wept privately for his soldiers, and the teacher who fought for his student, and the husband who sat in the dark with his grief and said the true thing out loud, all of them were still in there, somewhere underneath the black armor and the mechanical breathing, waiting with the patience of someone who has always known how the story ends, because they have been feeling the current of it their entire life. He dies as Anakin Skywalker. The Force releases him from the suit, and whatever was in him that had persisted through everything, the essential quality of him that was not Vader and had never been Vader, regardless of what name he was given, returns to the Force as itself, not as the tragedy, not as the cautionary tale, as the person. The boy from Tatooine, who loved speed and built things and grieved without being allowed to grieve and protected without being allowed to protect and loved without being allowed to love, and found, at the very end, the one moment where all of those things that had been constrained and suppressed and weaponized and twisted could express themselves cleanly. One act, one irreversible, total, entirely characteristic act of throwing himself between someone he loved and the thing that was hurting them at the cost of everything, which is exactly what love looks like when it is operating without any remaining reservations about the price. The galaxy remembers Darth Vader. This is inevitable and perhaps appropriate. What he was capable of as the Empire's instrument was real, and its consequences were real. And the people who suffered them cannot and should not be asked to reframe that suffering in the light of a redemption they were not present for. The galaxy remembers the black armor and the crushed corridors and the destroyed planets and the 2 decades of terror, and it has every right to. But there was something else. There was a person who existed before the armor and who never entirely stopped existing during it, and who was still there at the end, looking at his son with his own eyes for the first and only time, telling him that he was right. There was a builder and a pilot and a grieving son and an extraordinary teacher and a loyal commander and a husband who was afraid in ways that were entirely reasonable, given everything that had been taken from him. There was someone who could not stop caring about specific people, even when the institutional frameworks of his life required him not to. There was someone for whom joy and grief were equally total, equally without reservation, equally connected to the deepest and most ungovernable parts of who he was. There was Anakin Skywalker. He was there the whole time. And almost nobody was paying attention to him. The near turns deserve more space than they usually get, because they are not merely interesting footnotes to the main narrative. They are the main narrative if you are telling the story of who he actually was, rather than the story of what he eventually became. At least 3 times across the Clone Wars, Anakin Skywalker stood at something that functioned as a genuine choice point, a moment where the accumulated weight of everything could have resolved differently, and the fact that it did not resolve differently each time had less to do with his fundamental nature than with the specific combination of circumstances and the specific absences in his support structure that made the alternative feel unreachable. The first of those 3 moments is in some ways the most instructive and the most ignored. During the Mortis arc, Anakin encountered something that the Jedi Order had long considered myth. Actual living embodiments of the Force's fundamental poles. A father figure whose entire purpose was maintaining balance between a daughter who represented the light and a son who represented the darkness. The son, recognizing Anakin as the chosen one, showed him the future. He showed him what Anakin Skywalker would become. Not vaguely, not symbolically, but specifically and in full detail. The armor and the lightsaber and the Jedi massacre and the Empire and the decades of terror and the son on the floor of the throne room screaming. He showed him everything. And Anakin, for a period on that strange world outside of normal space, fell. He accepted the vision and the power that came with it, and he moved toward the darkness with a decisiveness that alarmed everyone who witnessed it. And then he came back. The father erased the memory of the vision, which resolved the immediate crisis, but the pattern of what happened deserves attention. Anakin, shown the full truth of what he would become, did not simply capitulate to it. He fought against it. He struggled with it. The pull toward the darkness was real and powerful, but so was the pull back toward the light. And when circumstances intervened to give him a way out of the choice, he took it. He was not a person who secretly wanted to become Vader. He was a person who was at war with that possibility inside himself, who was fighting it with the limited tools available to him, and who would have needed very specific and very sustained support to win that fight against a dark side that had centuries of accumulated technique for identifying and using exactly the vulnerabilities he carried. The second near turn is quieter and more painful. It happens across several episodes of the war involving a population of beings that the Republic had decided were unworthy of rescue and that the Separatists were exploiting with a particular brutality. Anakin pushed back. He argued against the Council's position, against the Republic's strategic assessment, against the conclusion that the cost of intervention outweighed the benefit. He did this with a specific and detailed moral case, not with the impulsive rejection of authority that his reputation for rule-breaking might suggest, but with an argument about what the Republic's values were supposed to mean, and whether they meant anything at all if they were only applied when the math was favorable. He lost the argument. The Council held its position, and the Republic followed strategic necessity rather than the moral case he was making. He complied with the order. He did not go rogue. He did not take unilateral action that the official record would have to account for. He argued with clarity and conviction, and then, when the argument failed, he did what the institution required. But he filed the loss. He remembered it. He added it to the accumulating record of moments when the institution had decided that principle was negotiable when the cost of principle was inconvenient. And the record grew longer with each entry, and the institution's hold on his loyalty grew correspondingly weaker. The third near turn is the one that happened through Ahsoka rather than directly to him, which is why it is so rarely understood as something that happened to him at all. When the Council expelled her and put her on trial, Anakin's response was not simply the protective fury of a mentor outraged on behalf of his student. It was a test that he nearly failed in the opposite direction from the one everyone assumes. He nearly left, not in the way he eventually left, pulled into the dark side by grief and fear and Palpatine's patient engineering. He nearly walked out the front door. He nearly looked at what the institution had done to Ahsoka and made the clean decision that this was not a place he could remain. He stayed because Ahsoka stayed. In a sense, because his investigation produced the truth that cleared her name, and the immediate crisis was resolved, and the Council apologized, and there was nothing left to walk out into. But the impulse was there. The recognition that the institution was capable of this, and that remaining in it required an ongoing choice to overlook that capability. He chose to remain, but it was a choice in a way it had not quite been before. And every choice freely made to stay in a place that has hurt you carries a cost to the next choice, and the cost accumulates. There is a version of this story in which Anakin Skywalker finds the support he needs. It is not an optimistic fantasy or a naive what-if. It is a realistic possibility that was foreclosed by specific failures, rather than inevitable. Imagine a Jedi Order that had a framework for working with adults, for receiving people who came to them already formed rather than pliable. Imagine an Obi-Wan who had been trained not only in the philosophical disciplines of the Jedi, but in the simpler and rarer skill of sitting with another person's grief without immediately redirecting it. Imagine a council that, confronted with the most powerful Force user in living memory, had been curious about him rather than wary, had spent energy understanding what he needed rather than managing what he might do. Imagine any one person among all the people who knew and cared about Anakin Skywalker being able to hear the specific thing he was trying to say and stay present with it long enough to matter. The fear of loss was real. The grief was real. The terror of the dreams was real. None of those things were unworkable on their own. People survive grief. People learn to live with fear. People find ways to carry the weight of loving someone who might be taken from them without being destroyed by it. The tool for doing that is connection, the specific and sustained experience of not being alone with the thing that is most frightening to you. Anakin Skywalker was profoundly alone with the most frightening thing in his life from the day he left Tatooine. That is not destiny. That is circumstance. And circumstances can be different. The people who loved him each gave him something real. Obi-Wan gave him discipline and structure and the craft of being a Jedi. Padme gave him the experience of being loved specifically as himself, without the institutional frame. Rex gave him the experience of genuine equality, of being challenged and respected by someone who did not need anything from the hierarchy of his position. Ahsoka gave him the experience of teaching and being changed by what he taught. Palpatine gave him the terrible gift of being heard without judgment, which was real, even though everything else about what Palpatine offered him was a lie built to serve a purpose. Each of those gifts was genuine, and each of them was insufficient on its own. And the tragedy is that the people who gave them were never quite able to give them in combination, never quite able to coordinate the specific offerings they had in ways that might have added up to the thing he actually needed. He needed all of it at once, from people who knew what he needed and could see each other and share the weight. He got pieces of it from people operating largely in isolation from each other. And the gaps between the pieces were where the darkness found its footholds. The child who built things in the desert would have been horrified by what he became. This is not a poetic observation. It is a practical one about the specific nature of who that child was. He was someone for whom the act of making was an expression of love, for whom the purpose of his extraordinary capabilities was to solve problems for people he cared about rather than to accumulate power for its own sake. He was someone who could not look at a person in distress without moving toward them, who had an instinctive and barely governable compulsion to put himself between anyone he loved and anything that threatened them. He was someone who felt everything enormously and had the misfortune of existing in an institutional context that treated enormous feeling as a liability and an age that did not have adequate language for what he was experiencing, let alone adequate frameworks for helping him work with it rather than against it. He was not built to be Vader. He was built to be something extraordinary and good. And he got part way there, all the way there in some moments and in some relationships. And then a set of circumstances conspired to take that thing apart at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way. The galaxy across the years of the Empire told the story of the fall as a lesson about power, about what happens when someone is too strong and too emotional and too attached and too willing to break the rules. The lesson it extracted was that the Jedi were right, that attachment is dangerous, that feeling too much is a vulnerability, that the solution to Anakin Skywalker was to produce fewer Anakin Skywalkers and more people who could hold their grief at the appropriate distance. This lesson is almost perfectly wrong. The problem was not that he felt too much. The problem was that he was alone with it. The problem was not that he loved Padme. The problem was that loving her had to be a secret, which meant that the fear of losing her also had to be a secret, which meant that the most terrifying thing in his life had to be carried in isolation without any of the ordinary human mechanisms for making terror bearable. The problem was not that he was angry. The problem was that the anger had nowhere legitimate to go, that the institution he served had no framework for receiving it, that every time it surfaced, it was treated as evidence of his insufficiency rather than a signal that something real was happening that needed to be addressed. The problem, to put it simply, is that he was a person and was treated as an asset, as a prophecy, as a weapon, as a problem to be managed, as a symbol of something larger than himself, with only fragmentary and insufficient exceptions across his entire life. And people who are treated that way develop the specific kind of wound that he developed. The wound of never being quite sure that anyone sees them, that anyone is responding to them specifically rather than to the role they fill, that the love and care they receive is for them as opposed to for what they represent. He had that wound from the beginning, and it was never adequately addressed, and eventually someone who understood it perfectly found it and used it. What he deserved was simpler than any of this. He deserved a childhood that was not slavery. He deserved a mentor who could be with him emotionally as well as intellectually. He deserved an institution that was capable of being wrong about him and acknowledging it. He deserved to love Padme openly, to be afraid about the pregnancy openly, to grieve openly, to need things openly, and have those needs received without judgment or redirection. He deserved, in short, the ordinary things that the circumstances of his life conspired to deny him at every turn. The ordinary things that most people take so completely for granted that they do not understand what the absence of them can do to a person over time. The Force chose him for something extraordinary, and the galaxy could not make room for the ordinary things he needed to be whole. That is not a story about destiny or the dark side or the eternal struggle between light and shadow. That is a story about a person who needed things that were never quite available to him, in an institution that did not quite understand what it had taken on, in a time that did not have adequate tools for what he was carrying, surrounded by people who loved him and could not reach him, and watched him fall without ever quite seeing clearly what was falling or why. He was the Anakin that nobody talks about before he was anything else. The builder, the pilot, the grieving son, the loyal commander, the fiercely devoted teacher, the secret husband, the person in the cockpit who flew with a joy that 20 years of darkness never entirely managed to extinguish. He was all of those things for as long as he was allowed to be them, and some of those things for longer than he was supposed to be, longer than the armor suggested was possible, long enough that his son could feel them across 2 decades of separation, and choose to stand in a throne room unarmed and say, "I know you are still in there." Long enough that the feeling was true. Long enough that the act it produced at the end was not a miracle or a surprise, but the logical conclusion of a person who had always been, underneath everything else, exactly this. Someone who put himself between the people he loved and the things that threatened them. Someone who built things for other people out of whatever materials were available. Someone who flew because the air was the one place where he was always entirely himself. Someone who was there and present and real, even when nobody was paying attention to him. Especially then. The tragedy is not that he fell. The tragedy is the distance between who he was and who he might have been, and how small that distance looks when you examine it clearly. How few and how specific the things were that would have needed to be different. How ordinary and how achievable the missing pieces would have been in any world slightly more attentive to what it had in front of it. He was not a warning about power. He was not proof that feeling too deeply leads to ruin. He was a person, a specific, irreducible, genuinely extraordinary person who needed things that were not available to him, and paid a price for that absence that the entire galaxy shared. The boy who looked up at the twin moons of Tatooine and knew he was going to be among the stars was right. He was there. He always was. That is what nobody talks about, and it is, in the end, the only thing worth saying. He flew the stars and grieved in silence, and built wonders out of nothing and loved people completely, and was failed by almost everyone who was supposed to help him carry that, and kept going anyway, longer than anyone had the right to expect, further than the darkness should have allowed, all the way to a son's face seen with his own eyes one last time before he went home to the Force and became, finally and completely and without reservation, exactly who he had always been underneath everything else. Anakin Skywalker, the one that nobody saw coming, the one that nobody saw at all. Not clearly, not fully, not until it was almost too late, and then just barely in time. The one that was always there. There is a version of every person that the world does not see. The version that exists in the gap between what they are asked to be and what they actually are. The version that carries the things nobody else knows how to hold, that feels the things that the official narrative has no room for, that reaches for what it needs with the persistence of something that cannot stop reaching because the need is too fundamental to suppress. For Anakin Skywalker, that version is the one this story has tried to tell. The one before the armor and during it and after it, in his son's eyes. In the Force. Still reaching, still building something out of whatever materials the moment provides. He is there. He was always there. That is what nobody talks about. And it is, if you are willing to look, the most important thing.